what strategists of nuclear deterrence understand is that if you threaten to use a weapon in retaliation and you're provoked and you don't use it, that weapon becomes useless because nobody thinks you'll ever use it. So if the Russians were to use a nuclear weapon or a chemical weapon and we were not to respond in kind, our nuclear arsenal becomes really expensive and completely useless. So I think as a retaliatory measure, we have to use nukes. If the Russians use nukes in Ukraine, we have to. Otherwise, they're useless. So then the question is, are the Russians stupid enough to think that they can use a tactical nuke and get away with it?
Thank you for joining me on this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Today I have a returning guest, Dr. Shawn Williams. He's in the political science program at Campbellsville University. And today we're going to talk about a couple of different items. First, we're going to start off with what's going on at the southern border. And we want to get Dr. Williams' perspective from a systems approach as well as policy approach in government. So thanks for being here. I appreciate you taking the time.
Happy to be here as always.
Where do you want to start at the southern border?
Well, if you want to start at the southern border, really you kind of have to go down to what's happening in Honduras and what's happening in Cuba. Because a lot of the migration that we're seeing right now has been driven by the destabilization of those governments. Cuba's government's strong, but the economy has basically collapsed under the weight of COVID for a lot of different reasons. The Honduran government for the past 7 or 8 years has basically turned left, and a dictatorial regime has been slowly tightening its grip. Gang violence that was happening in Colombia and in Guatemala has moved further north, and that's leading to an exodus of people who...
Haiti's not in such good shape.
Haiti is always has an earthquake or corruption or both happening at the same time. And the combination of these factors is just driving people to hope for a better future.
Why not Canada or any other number of countries? Why is our southern border apparently
That's a great question. A bit of it's geography. I mean, it's easier to walk than it is to fly or swim, right, to get to Canada. But part of it is also, a big part of it is that it is very, very, very difficult and dangerous to travel to a place where you know no one and you have no connections. So what we know about migration is that you are much more likely to travel to a country or to a part of a country where someone that you know already has legal residence or has established a legal base. So if you are Mexican or Honduran or Cuban, the country where your friends, families, and cousins are most likely to have gained legal residency is the United States, because they came here as a migrant worker or to work in an industrial farm or any number of factors. Because many of these countries saw large migrations in the 1970s or 80s. So they have cousins who've been here for a generation or two. And so they come back to the United States. Whereas if we were to see influx of migration from Southeast Asia, Canada would be a much more logical place for people to go because there's a large Asian population in Vancouver, for example.
One of the things in a discussion earlier this week, a friend of mine had mentioned that there were both parties are to blame, and for really the same reason. And she mentioned that the Obama administration, with the undocumented children policy, was just a huge influx from that standpoint of just children coming over, children that families would say, here, take go, and that we would take them in as from a social structure standpoint as one thing, and then conversely with the Trump administration, it was more about it was sort of the paradox of saying, we've got all these civil, we've got it good over here. We don't need to let anybody in, right. Which is just really an advertisement, come on in. And then what we do is we separate the children then. And so one of the things, and the reason I bring this up is because we've got such a mass migration happening now, immigration, illegal immigration. But the point that she shared with me was what this does from the individual point of view as these children grow up without really families, if they aren't reunited with their families, and what that might mean in terms of how they fit into society.
You have to go back the clock, roll back the clock to the 1970s and 80s. It was Ronald Reagan that granted a blanket amnesty to illegal immigrants from the south of the border, to Mexicans, Hondurans, Cubans. It was, I guess, with the Nixon administration that was responsible for the immigrant flood from Cuba and Haiti. We have had a broken immigration system for a long time now. There's a piece of legislation that was passed in the early 1960s that fundamentally changed how we thought about immigrant populations and host countries and target countries. Yeah, our immigration system has been broken for a long time. And it's this, I think you got it right, it's this combination of the fact that we need a certain amount of immigrant labor for our economy to work, that culturally and as Christians we have a historical soft spot for immigrants and for immigration. And then also the reality that there's only so many places we can have people sleep at night, and only so many jobs that we have available, and only so many people who we can accept at one time. And the combination of all those realities have made for just a completely broken immigration system, and one that neither party really has a vested interest in fixing.
Why?
Because both of them gain political advantage from it at different times. For the Democratic Party, there's a certain value to having immigrants coming in for rhetorical reasons, and for the fact that their population base, their support base is increasingly minority. For Republicans, the business community needs immigrant labor. They've been saying agriculture has to have a migrant labor workforce in order for it to survive.
Cheap food. It's not as cheap as it was, but still.
Right, and
cheaper than the rest of the world.
We need service sector. And there's a certain logic that says that if your goal is to educate your population to work high-paying jobs, and you still need a low-paid service sector economy, that workforce has to come from somewhere. And so for conservatives, they don't always want to have the labor supply shut down. And for liberals, they don't always want immigrants not around. And so neither one of them has an interest in a permanent fix. Not really. And they both get political advantage from it.
Is it breaking the system? I mean, when I say this, I mean our support system for so many things. Is it really that bad, or are we just in the middle of this political pandering to their base?
The problem with a lot of policy issues is that we know, and we have known for a very long time, that immigration is a net plus for the United States. My family were almost all immigrants to this country. It's a net plus for the United States. But the costs of immigration are being borne predominantly by the few states that are along the border, not only financially, but also culturally, not only culturally, but also politically. And when you are Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and you're bearing the brunt of the cost of taking all these people in, but you're the Northeast or the Northwest, and you're reaping only the benefits of the supply of labor that they provide, it creates a challenge for us. And part of solving the immigration crisis means figuring out how do we balance the costs across all 50 states so that the benefits can also be realized by all 50 states. And so when you ask, is the system breaking? Well, it's breaking in Texas. It's breaking in Arizona. Could Kentucky take an extra 50,000 to 75,000 immigrants a year? Sure, absolutely. I mean, I can't go to Taco Bell and get a Mexican pizza because there's not enough labor there, right? We can certainly take more people in our workforce, but that's not how the system's functioning or not functioning right now.
It's a humanitarian issue as well. And I mean, the logistics of it, if there were a way to, a system really of moving them from where they're at now, but that has to be a logistical nightmare, and it's ended up being a issue of humanity. And so where are we at right now? What's in
We haven't
Or
had.
do we really not care? I shouldn't ask that
No,
question.
I think that we as Americans, we care a lot, but we don't care enough to provide good solutions. You know, the Trump administration solution was to kind of shut down the border. The problem is that most immigration doesn't actually happen at the border, because all you have to do is get on an airplane and fly from Mexico City to San Antonio, and half of all immigration happens through tourist visas or whatever. Half of all illegal immigration happens through otherwise legal means. And so shutting down the border is only partially successful. Turns out you can dig a hole under a wall, right? And so we missed an opportunity there. And then with the Biden administration, they politically decided to take away some of the harshest aspects of the Trump policy, but without providing anything like a resettlement or control program in its place. And now you have a backup at the border that's overwhelmed our ability to process the difference between a legitimate refugee from Honduras and an illegitimate refugee from Honduras. And so
the idea that you find out that things are a little bit more lax at the border, so let's go, and whole communities, it sounds like, are just sort of en masse, just saying, okay, let's go. Now, and that may be an over exaggeration based on media hype, but
yeah, I have an assignment.
Pictures are pretty.
I have an assignment that I have my students, my political geography class, have them do. It's an article about a part of Spain that's actually in North Africa, because through historical reasons and colonial reasons, there's a little bit of Spain that's on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea. And so its economy is Spanish, its culture is Spanish, its language is Spanish, and across the border is Morocco. And what happens is people from all over Africa will go to this little sliver of Spain, and they will wait until there are a few thousand people at the border, and then they will en masse attempt to overwhelm the Spanish border fences. And there are a series of 3 or 4 or 5 layers of defense, everything from pits to barbed wire to dogs to humans. And of those few thousand people, a couple of dozen will make it past. And if they do, then they can claim refugee status in the European Union. And wave after wave of thousands of people show up at the border, because the more you have, the more likely it is a few people will get through.
So it's a lottery ticket scenario where it's just like,
it's a great,
this might be my lucky day.
It's a great analogy.
Week or however often.
That's a great analogy. And so the same thing's happening at our border, where the system can only handle so many people. And if I know 5,000 people are going to be hitting the system, I might be one of the fortunate 500 who make it through, and I'm willing to take those odds, because it's better than going back to where I came from, where I'll probably die.
Where are the? Well, there's a couple of questions. One, going back to where they came from, and I know one of the strategies is to try to help those economies, those countries, be better overall, and make it so that people wouldn't want to leave. Yeah. What do you know about that? What sort of policies are going on?
Back in the 1980s and 1990s, this is actually one of the things that NAFTA was kind of supposed to do with Mexico. And there's something called CAFTA, which is the Central American Free Trade Association, which was similar to what NAFTA was intended to be. A number of our policies were built around that idea, that we would send American factories to Central America. That's actually how the Fruit of the Loom factory from Campbellsville in 1999 ended up going down to, I believe it was Honduras. Part of the logic was we could send American factories and American manufacturing to these countries, rather than bringing people from those countries to our country to do the jobs. And it had some success, and there was some downside to that as well. Loss of American jobs, certainly to be one of those things. But it had some success. What's happening right now, though, is the Honduran political system is effectively collapsing. So there is no American capital that wants to go into that region. There is no American capital wanting to go into Venezuela. No American capital is allowed to go into Cuba. So we can't pursue those policies. The other problem is that those policies work over a period of 5 to 10 years. Right. Rather than we have a million people.
Approach to it.
Yeah, it's a long-term strategy. And long-term strategies haven't exactly been the strong suit of the last 5 years of American politics.
So even if things got better politically, some stabilization within the country, it's going to be 5 to 10 years before it really makes a difference with just everyday people and the economy. Is it?
These kinds of long-term solutions they're harder to implement.
Yeah.
They're more effective. They're much better 20, 30, 40 years from now, but it's not a solution to the crisis tomorrow.
Right. Which is that brings up the question. So, what do you hear that we're trying to do?
I don't know that anybody has a good plan. The only there cannot be.
Do they have a plan? I mean, at this point, does it have to be great or even?
I think it was about 3 years ago. I was actually up on Capitol Hill and was having a conversation with the chief of staff. I believe it was for Rand Paul's office. And as we were discussing the problem of the Dreamers Act and the concerns that Paul's staff had about the Dreamers Act, they made the point, and I think this is a vital one, that any plan has to deal with migration, it has to deal with legal and illegal immigration, it has to deal with the jobs problem in all 50 states, it has to deal with the people who are here now and the people who might come in the future. And that kind of a broad scale solution, there's just no political will and no room for political compromise. There's no way that you could have a solution to this problem unless Republicans are willing to allow people who are here legally to stay. There's no solution to this problem until Democrats are willing to say.
Which it sounds like that just exacerbates the problem, because then you have a whole nother wave of people who are like to take advantage, because that's what you were saying happened in the 80s, right? And then,
which means that you would also need to have part of that plan is going to have to require a long-term strategy to prevent the inflow, and the Democrats don't seem to have a will to follow any kind of long-term plan to stop the inflow into the system. And absent both sides seeing advantage, we're kind of stuck in this crisis.
Well, yeah, and where do you see the crisis going? How do you think that's going to? I mean, there's obviously going to be economic issues, humanity issues, political issues. Of what?
My hope is, so what DeSantis and what Abbott are doing right now. At the time that we're filming this, DeSantis is the governor of Florida, just got through sending a bunch of immigrants from El Paso essentially to Martha's Vineyard, which is a stunt that Greg Abbott down in Texas had done, sending them to D.C. and Chicago. Those are political stunts, and there's lots of problems with them, but what they're highlighting is this issue of inequality between benefits and costs. And so the best solution we could have right now would be if the states that are receiving the most benefit were actually to get serious and say, you know what, we can take 40,000 immigrants in the state of New York, and let's partner with Florida rather than having them dropped off in Connecticut or dropped off in Delaware. Let's actually develop a system where we can relocate these through.
In front of the vice president's house. I mean,
right.
You can't get much more circus act than that.
Right.
I get the point. Yeah, I mean, it definitely.
And if we could develop that kind of a system working through nonprofits or through churches, then that would certainly go a long way to alleviate the crisis. But I don't see a political will on the part of Texas to work with Illinois, and I don't necessarily know that I see a political will on the part of Illinois to.
Well, especially
work
with
Texas.
Midterms coming up. That's how do you think that this plays out? That's part of what y'all like to do, think about how these things work in the future.
The interesting thing that's happening is that for most of Americans, immigration is not the same problem that it was in 2016, whenever Trump was elected. And he was able to use immigration as a big part of his platform. And part of the reason why immigration isn't working the same way is because we have a perceived labor shortage where we can't get access to the kinds of food services that we had before, in part because some of those places were depending upon illegal labor at some point in the supply chain or distribution chain. And so since Americans basically have jobs, if you want one, you can find one.
Manual labor in general, just try to get somebody to come out and repair something.
And so questions of immigration are not nearly as important to us as the overturning of Roe versus Wade, or inflation, or the war in Ukraine, or any number of political issues that have pushed immigration to the bottom. And so while it's working really well among the right to kind of mobilize them to pay attention, independents and liberals, it doesn't seem to be an electoral question for them right now. They're much more concerned about other
Looking
things.
beyond that particular crisis right now
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, that may be different in 2024 if this is still an issue, but today that's not a primary concern.
So
can
the
see.
right's going to leverage anything that it can
Yeah.
to gain, but
To get people to the
but you really
polls,
don't
but-
see that as being that.
Not when you compare to, because in part what the right's trying to find is they know that they are suffering a little bit from the overturn of Roe versus Wade, that didn't hit the American public the way that they thought it did, and that there are a lot of people who are moderates who probably would have been okay with something like a 15-week abortion ban, but they're not really okay with a full abortion ban or an abortion ban without restrictions. And all indications are that that's resulted in a significant move to the left among voters, and is going to bring people to the polls in November that wouldn't have otherwise. And so immigration is a topic that I think Republicans believe that they can counterbalance that with, because it worked for them in 2016.
Well, they're the states that are already polarized by it, you might say. From that standpoint, excuse me, from that standpoint, they're in the middle of it. They're already thinking about it.
Yeah.
But the other states that should be participating, based on
Yeah.
what you're saying, something
It doesn't
like
matter.
Roe versus Wade is because it's more. I don't want to say personal. That's not what I mean.
No, it's a fair point.
But it's more real to them than this thing that happens down in Texas and,
Yeah.
and Florida.
If you're a female under the age of 43, the overturning of Roe versus Wade is much more important to you than the question of what happens along the Texas border. It is a much more real and prescient topic. Or if you're the father of a woman who's 22, 23 years old and you think might be sexually active, the repeal of Roe versus Wade is much more important to you than what might be happening on the border. If you live in a northeastern state, or if you live in Washington state or Pennsylvania. And so for that reason, it's not rising to that level. But Arizona as a swing state, Florida as a swing state, where the current governor is running for re-election, has hopes for running for presidency in 2 years, questions of immigration are potentially mobilizing for them. And so they're trying to use that to their advantage.
Gotcha. Do you mind if we turn west now from the south?
Sure.
And let's go west. Speaking of how politics is going to play a part, and actually, as I'm thinking more about from a personal standpoint, how is the war in Ukraine?
Oh, that's far west. Yeah.
Yeah, that far west. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go to another country. And,
Yeah.
And speaking of immigrants, because my understanding is we'll tie it together that way. How's that?
Yeah.
That some of the displaced, even from Ukraine, are showing up at the southern border.
They are, because it's kind of the easiest place. Again, that's where the system's being overwhelmed. It's the easiest place to get in. Yeah, the war in Ukraine, I think what has caught people off guard, and I think what most policy analysts now understand, is there's a chance that it could have been over in 2 or 3 weeks. And once it made it to 2 or 3 months, now it looks like it's going to be 2 or 3 years. Ukraine has managed to, I think...
Is that really
Yeah.
positive thinking, 2 or 3 years? I mean, the last few wars, 2 or 3 years were...
There are a lot of reasons why I would argue that 2 or 3 years is the appropriate number. Some of it's militarily, just boots on the ground, and the longer Russia's in territory it's controlling, the better they are to establish defenses in those territories. Part of it is also, I was discussing this with some of my students, that when you think about why would a Vladimir Putin agree to ending the war, why would the Ukrainians or Zelensky agree to ending the war? Under what circumstances would the Americans or the Europeans say we're no longer going to support the Ukrainians? When did the Chinese say we've had enough with this, Russia? 2 to 3 years, for lots of reasons, is about the timeline where I think the West starts to become exhausted As we,
Financially or emotionally or all of the above?
All of the above. I also think that if I'm Ukraine and I'm thinking strategically about my most important ally, the United States, the closer we get to 2025 and the possibility that a Trump or a Trump supporter might become the next president, the less sure I am the United States will continue to have my back. Right? We know that Biden and probably any future Democratic president, if Biden doesn't run, will be strong supporters of the Ukrainians because they have staked their political claim on that. Less sure about what Trump would do.
And I want to get back to, but I actually have two questions here.
Yeah.
But I want to get back to in a minute how we got from 2 or 3 weeks to 2 or 3 years.
Sure.
But what do you think? I mean, in let's say Trump was president, would we be supporting Ukraine?
I think we would. I don't think we'd be providing the level of support. I don't think that we'd be providing the amount of support. And the reason why I think so is Trump, take COVID for example, politically, Trump's supporters were not exactly pro, let's fight COVID with everything we have. But as a leader, Donald Trump recognized that we have to confront COVID because of the effects that the pandemic could have on the population. I think that Trump or a DeSantis or whoever might be the next Republican presidential nominee, I think they understand what's at stake if Ukraine were to fall to Russia. At the same time, their priorities aren't exactly pro-European expansionist, pro-NATO, pro-United Nations. They have other things that they're concerned about because the Republican Party is more nationalistic than what it would have been, say, during the Bush 1 or Bush 2 administrations. And so for those reasons, I think that we would be supporting Ukraine. Would we be giving them the same level of support, the same amount of weapon systems? Would we slowly start to decrease the financial aid? Would we be asking them to do more to prove up that they're not misusing or abusing our love? We probably would be doing all those things as a way of preparing, extracting us. And I think that in 2 or 3 years, what we're going to find is that the Republican frontrunners are probably going to be at a point where they're either going to have to say Joe Biden was right, we need to stick with it, or Joe Biden is wrong, we're going to have to leave. Yeah. And given those two choices, I think that in 23, 24, the Republican Party is going to be looking at an exit strategy from Ukraine if the war's still going on, which is why I think that for the Ukrainians, 2 to 3 years is about the length of their window. And I think for the Russians, that probably is as well, because in 2 or 3 years, they're going to start to realize that China's kind of buying up a lot of their industry and that they're getting deeper and deeper into debt to the Chinese or to the Iranians or to the North Koreans. And in 2 or 3 years, that cost of continued servitude or relationship to outside agents will become too great, and they're going to have a way out.
Well, how committed do you think the Russians are to this war and actually trying to win it? Or
that's the $5,000 question. I think that Vladimir Putin has staked his personal relationship on the war, and I think that most Russians and the Russian leadership are starting to understand that the war is not in their national best interest. And so Vladimir Putin's going to have to...
It takes a lot of money and resources to...
They've just announced the mobilization of their reserves, which is going to mean tens of thousands of Russians.
When did that happen?
Today. This morning, Vladimir Putin, at the time of our filming, Vladimir Putin has just given a speech where he has basically partially mobilized the reserve. It's probably going to result in a mobilization of about 50 to 100,000 reservists. It'll take a couple of months to train them up, and there's some logistics there, but we would expect them to be in the war zone somewhere around early January as part of the defense of the Donbass region, or maybe as part of a new offensive initiative.
And does he have much? I mean, he almost has the double down, right? You're talking about his personal reputation.
His personal reputation, yeah.
For him to lose this would
be the end of
make him look weak.
Yeah, and so his choice is basically, do I sacrifice my personal relationship or do I sacrifice the long-term stability of the Russian Empire? And for now, he seems to be suggesting that he's doubling down for his personal reputation's reasons, even though it's going to be expensive to the Russian Empire. At some point, he may change his mind, or others may become convinced enough that his mind gets changed for him. But that's probably not something that will happen for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Because they can probably hold out for a little bit longer, I would think.
And so going back to that original question that you'd brought up the idea of, we're about to explain like how it got to a longer war. I mean, that's sort of where I hadn't really thought of it, but that's in the back of my mind. And how did that happen?
We often try to explain wars based upon previous military experiences, right? And whenever generals are developing strategy, they're often tied to the last war. And so I guess the easy way to explain it would be to say that the Russians thought that this was going to be like the German invasion in World War II, or the American invasion of Afghanistan, or the American invasion maybe of Iraq in 1991, where the great military power was going to go in, kick the doors down, the house was going to collapse. They would then be able to pursue a negotiated settlement. The Ukrainians would agree to give up part of their territory in exchange for their independence, and the Russians would then roll their tanks back down to the Black Sea. And if that were going to happen, that could have happened in 2 or 3 weeks. But it didn't, for a number of reasons, some of which were predictable and a lot of which weren't. And then once we understood that the Ukrainians weren't just going to fold, the next big step of it was when the Americans in the West decided that they would replenish Ukrainian military supply.
I think that's an example of each.
Yeah.
The Ukraine's resistance being unpredicted, that it would be
it's stronger than anybody thought it was going to be.
But then us, providing military support.
Right, because
that
I think
was predictable. They knew we would help, and NATO too. I mean,
we had made promises in the 1990s where we had basically told the Ukrainians, if you give up your nuclear arsenal, which protects you from Russia, we as the Americans and NATO will provide you with assistance should the Russians ever attack. And we have effectively lived up to our promise. Had the Russians been able to successfully take Kiev in the first 2 or 3 weeks, we wouldn't have had time to. But when the Russians were able to be stopped by the Ukrainians, that gave the West time to sort of mobilize their support, begin to provide military assistance. And then we're now starting to see the effect of that, where supplied with American and European military power, supplied with our logistical and strategical support, they've been able to launch a counteroffensive to the Russian advance.
Back, yeah.
And now they're starting to actually push back the Russians.
How sustainable is our level of support? And actually even more curious about the European level of support, given that winter's coming and they still are trying to figure out how to keep the lights on.
It's a matter of political will, really. It's sustainable as long as Americans are willing to put up with inflation, and as long as the Europeans are willing to say that stopping Russia is more important than a high electric bill.
Is there a Churchill around? I mean, is somebody
who can step up and kind of mobilize that support? And that's kind of the key question, is how cold is winter going to be? If winter is very cold in Europe, then that support might wane quickly. If it's a relatively mild winter, then they should be okay. And the same thing's true at the battlefield, incidentally. If this is a relatively mild and wet winter, then what's going to happen is you basically can't move heavy artillery pieces. The ground's too soggy in Ukraine.
Are we still in the 40s? Are we still Battle of the Bulge, sort of? I mean...
So coming back to the question that you had asked, why did the initial Russian invasion not work? Basically what happened was they put their oldest tanks at the front of the line so that the Ukrainians would blow those up first. But their oldest tanks were also the ones most likely to break down. Their best tanks were at the back of the line, but they couldn't drive off of the roads without getting bogged down in the wet terrain. And so when the tanks at the front of the line were hit or started to break down and their wheels wouldn't turn anymore because the axles hadn't been appropriately greased, the ones in the back were stuck, and all they could do was turn around and go back where they came from.
Why does that sound like an amateur move?
Yeah, it is.
I'm not, and again, it sounds like it. I'm not a strategist at all, but
and if the Ukrainians,
if you were wanting to get it over in 2 or 3 days or weeks,
yeah, you'd think you wouldn't
hit
have
them
done.
hard with the good stuff and
Yeah.
shock and awe, as
Yeah.
a saying we once had.
Yeah, mistakes were made. I think in hindsight, I think everyone, especially the Russians, realize that to quote Donald Rumsfeld, they misunderestimated, actually there's a George W. Bush quote, they misunderestimated the strength of the Ukrainian resistance.
Yeah.
And as a result, they failed to appreciate how much damage they were going to take. And then everything after that has been sort of trying to catch up to those initial estimates.
There's been some indication that the British Prime Minister is not above going nuclear. Have you heard that? Is that was it misquoted? I might have misunderstood.
Yeah, so the British Prime Minister has been in office now for, 2 weeks. She's really trying to figure out how this works.
She's been at a funeral for half of that.
Yeah, this is exactly right. She's been at the funeral for half of that. And so I think we have to understand that the things that she may or may not say, much like whenever Donald Trump became president for the first time or when Bill Clinton became president with very little political experience, it's going to take her a moment to really for us to be able to assume that her statements are actual policy. The other thing that you have to keep in mind...
That's got to get some people
Sure.
in Russia in particular like, hold on a second.
Yeah, and I think Vladimir Putin made mention of that there are those in the West who say they might use nuclear weapons. But her comments and our comments about nuclear weapons have essentially basically been the same. It's that if you use weapons of mass destruction, we will retaliate.
Tit for tat.
Not a we are going to use weapons as a way of ending this, but rather if you fail to observe the agreed upon terms of conflict, then we will bring out our heavy guns too.
Do you think there's anyone in power delusional enough to think that anything nuclear is a good idea?
Not in.
Did I don't think I miss.
No, I think
I
you.
think yeah.
I think that what strategists of nuclear deterrence understand is that if you threaten to use a weapon in retaliation and you're provoked and you don't use it, that weapon becomes useless because nobody thinks you'll ever use it. So if the Russians were to use a nuclear weapon or a chemical weapon and we were not to respond in kind, our nuclear arsenal becomes really expensive and completely useless. So I think as a retaliatory measure, we have to use nukes. If the Russians use nukes in Ukraine, we have to. Otherwise, they're useless. So then the question is, are the Russians stupid enough to think that they can use a tactical nuke and get away with it?
Now, are the nuclear weapons we're talking about now different than Cold War? Because what you're saying is essentially what kept peace, sort of in during the Cold War era, which is nobody really wants to use a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
And it seems like back then they were pretty massively destructive. I think
there's a slight difference. We had agreed to, during the Reagan administration, we had agreed to a series of nuclear protocols with the Soviets under the START agreements that essentially banned short-range tactical nuclear missiles and limited our arsenal to long-range strategic nuclear missiles. So basically, we can't use a nuke to blow up a city. You're kind of stuck with nukes that could blow up countries. George W. Bush withdrew us from that agreement, in large part because the Russians were cheating, to be fair to George W. Bush. And part of that cheating means that we think that both they and we have been developing some of these shorter-range tactical nukes. That's a little bit different. That's not something that was part of the Cold War for the 70s and 80s. So in that sense, yeah.
So you were talking about weapons of mass destruction, meaning it's all.
Yeah.
Like they hit and it just, miles and miles, tens of thousands square miles.
Yeah, range of impact.
The
difference between using something like a Hiroshima or a Nagasaki where you blow up a city as opposed to blanketing everything east of the Urals and ending life as we know it, right? And that tactical
versus taking down a few city blocks with the,
right. Recognizing that we don't really need to destroy all of Russia. What if we would just blow up the Crimea? Russia doesn't have to destroy all of Ukraine. What if they just nuked Kiev? And the result, if they were to nuke Kiev from the west, has to be we nuke Moscow.
Yeah.
Otherwise, our nuclear deterrent system has no value to us anymore.
And nor does our agreement with any of the other countries that will
Who
protect
we've promised to protect, yeah. Any chances of us defending Taiwan, any chances of us defending South Korea or Japan, they're out the window if we allow someone to use a nuke when we say we refuse. Then the entire global security system collapses. So yes, we will respond, and we just have to hope that the Russians understand that that's the position we're in.
Yeah. How do you think it's going to be for Europe in terms of the coming winter? And are we prepared to help them they're as a NATO, as allies?
Yeah.
Are we prepared to step in and send some of our? I don't even, some of the heating,
so one of the first things
stuff.
One of the first things the Biden administration actually started to do, and the Europeans weren't particularly receptive to the idea, is the Biden administration went to Europe and said, look, we think that you need to develop the capacity to receive liquefied natural gas from us, because we think you might have a problem with the Russians one day. Yeah. And the Europeans were largely hesitant on developing the coastal structure to basically have tankers docking in Antwerp or tankers docking in Denmark.
Why would they question our?
Well, I think they didn't really believe that the
favor.
Russians. I don't think they really believed that the Russians would actually invade.
So less about us and more about
the Russians. Yeah,
okay.
And also to step inside a little bit of the European mindset. The European Union was founded on this idea that France and Germany could end all wars in Europe by establishing trade peace. And so they developed an economic relationship where two countries that had fought 4 or 5 wars over the previous 170 years would never fight again. That same trade peace logic would apply to the Germans buying natural gas and oil from the Russians. That if the Russians know that we're buying all this energy from them, they will never invade because they would lose too much money. Yeah. And they know that we would never invade because they would turn our power off. And so part of the European balance that Angela Merkel was trying to strike was built around this logic of peace through trade relationships. And had they established a way for Americans to bring in natural gas, liquefied natural gas, some of that trade relationship would be undermined. And so they said, no, it's not in our national security interests. Long story short, since the invasion of Ukraine, the Europeans have changed their mind on this.
Yeah.
And as Americans,
but it takes a bit to build infrastructure like that.
And it takes a while to repurpose oil tankers for use as natural gas tankers. And it takes a while to build pipelines that run from France to Germany instead of the other way around. And so we're in the process of trying to provide them access to our energy markets, the cost of which is going to be that energy in America is going to be more expensive. Because rather than only selling it to American power plants.
Well, demand increases exponentially once you get that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you could expect to see higher energy prices in the U.S. if the United States is successful in helping to bail out the Europeans for their choices.
Well, it seems like even without Russia and their supply of gas, Europe was already having to deal with some of the energy decisions that were being made. This just seems to be, well, it's good timing for Putin, not so much good timing for the rest of Europe.
And that was probably part of the logic behind why Putin acted when he did. That the timing of the invasion of Ukraine had a lot to do with Putin being more worried about what Biden's reactions might be, less concerned about whether Trump would pursue an advantage. Angela Merkel had just stepped down as chancellor in Germany, and so there was somebody new in Germany. The British prime ministership under Boris Johnson was a little bit shaky. There are lots of reasons to think that the timing was right for Putin to act. Some of it having to do with the winter at the time, in the end of the Olympics, and so there are lots of reasons why it made sense for him to move when he did. They just again, misunderestimated the strength of resistance, and now here we are.
Well, we've come quite a distance here. I did have one other question, and in some ways it relates to my interest in artificial intelligence. So on one spectrum, if we think about the spectrum of weapons and use of weapons, all the crappy tanks, are on one side, nuclear's on the other. We've got a lot of other conventional, but we also have things like the report I saw about the Iranian kamikaze drones. We have we already have weaponized drones, and some of which are autonomous. Those aren't nuclear, but they're a lot better than old tanks that are ground bound, so to speak. I mean, surface bound, if you will. Yeah. What do you think? What do you know that's going on, and where do you think that's going?
So far, a lot of that technology, it's still technology that requires some kind of a human pilot, or it requires some level of communication with a central server system. However, one of the things that the conflict in Ukraine revealed was that if you are flying a drone behind enemy territory, in the enemy has the ability to scramble that communication, you basically have a drone flying without a pilot, a plane without anybody controlling it. What my suspicion is, and from what I understand what is happening, is that the first level of AI application to drones will basically be, in the event that you lose communication with your controller, what decisions will your onboard computer be making? What is your first target? What is your second target? Do we have the ability to teach a computer what an enemy tank looks like?
If you can't know what you're going to.
Right. If I'm not told where to go, do I just get told to turn around and fly back home again, wherever home came from? And I think that's where the first level of AI tech is going to be in drone systems, is what level of independent processing.
Do you think we'll
be
seeing that in Ukraine?
I don't know.
We're already getting hints that there are some things.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we will get to that level yet, in part because drone technology right now is being favored because it's relatively low cost. So the reason why Russians are buying Iranian drones is because they're cheap. The reason why the Ukrainians bought Turkish drones is because they're cheap. They don't cost nearly as much as a missile system, but they're much more effective. But I certainly think that the consequence of the Ukrainian war is the next generation of drones, or the next time we see drones deployed in combat, they'll probably be independent or semi-autonomous in at least part of their mission. Whereas Americans, what we've typically used drones for up till now is either reconnaissance or taking out specific individual targets, where we have a ground spotter who's identified that there's a high-value target working for Al-Qaeda or some other group, and drones provide us with a missile deployment system. I would expect to see in the next 10 years us developing weapons where we could basically fly it towards an enemy front, give it a profile of possible enemy targets, allow it to identify a number of vehicles that might be in the area, figure out which one's the highest value, and then attack that without a controller.
AI to AI, do you think that sort of, and I don't mean it just in the sort of cyber sense of.
So there was an article published a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago actually, where a group of American scientists based out of some northeastern universities were proposing that the best anti-missile defense system would actually be a fleet of autonomous or semi-autonomous networked drones, so that the drones would be deployed, and then as a missile is coming in either from space or from the ground, the drones would basically identify the trajectory of the missile and collapse
take on the old missile shield that was 90s and early 2000s.
Exactly, except instead of it being space-based technology that never existed, using drone technology where the drones could communicate with each other and receive some signals from the ground. Largely automated, though. What was interesting about it was that this paper and this approach was initially completely shot down and obliterated, but the paper that obliterated this approach was just retracted 2 days ago. Because it turns out that a lot of the science that was used to discredit the strategy has been debunked. And the proponents of the strategy are saying, see, I told you so. And it's entirely possible that this is the point, that what the Americans are looking at doing is building something like a dome protective shield that could be deployed over a city that could intercept incoming non-nuclear missiles and destroy them before they land using some kind of an autonomous networked drone network. Yeah.
Wow, what a world we
Yeah.
have developed, I guess, or that's been developing around us.
Yeah.
I appreciate your time. Are there any final thoughts that you have?
Thank you for letting me be here. I appreciate it.
Oh, always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification icon to be notified whenever we have new updates. And thank you.